The clock read 8:42 a.m. as Kendrick Robinson pulled into the parking lot of the municipal courthouse in Greenville, South Carolina. The warm morning sunlight spilled across the asphalt, casting long shadows as Kendrick exhaled deeply. He hated being late. As a federal prosecutor, his world revolved around precision and preparation. But today, the morning seemed determined to test him. What should have been a routine task, challenging an error in the property tax adjustment on the home his grandmother had left him, had turned into anything but simple. The house wasn't just property, it was the cornerstone of Kendrick's childhood, the place where his grandmother's steady hand had taught him right from wrong. Dressed in a sharp navy suit with a crisp white shirt, Kendrick exuded the poise of a seasoned attorney, even if the morning had been anything but smooth. An urgent phone call about a human trafficking case had derailed his schedule. The defense team had filed a last-minute motion, and Kendrick couldn't ignore it. After reviewing the motion and sending feedback to his team, he had rushed to court, cutting it painfully close. As he ascended the courthouse steps, his phone buzzed. A quick glance revealed a message from his assistant. The judge in Greenville has a reputation for being tough on latecomers. Be careful. Kendrick sighed, slipping the phone into his briefcase. He wasn't particularly worried, facts were his weapon, and he had come armed with evidence. Still, the warning lingered uneasily in his mind. Shaking off the thought, he stepped into the cool interior of the courthouse. Unlike the grand federal courts Kendrick frequented, the municipal courthouse was utilitarian and worn. Dull beige walls, scuffed seating, and the faint smell of coffee and aged paper greeted him. Despite its drab appearance, the courthouse bustled with energy as people shuffled about, clutching documents and wearing expressions of quiet anxiety. Parking tickets, small claims, and minor disputes consumed the air. Kendrick checked his watch, 8:50 a.m. barely 10 minutes to find the right courtroom. Following the signs, he made his way down a narrow hallway where hushed voices filled the air. At the door labeled Room 204, Judge Charles Whitman, Kendrick adjusted his tie and stepped inside. The room was already filling with people. Spotting a seat near the back, he sat down, flipping open his folder to review his evidence. As he skimmed his notes, the courtroom suddenly shifted. Judge Charles Whitman entered, his presence commanding instant attention. Tall, with a silver mane and piercing blue eyes, he emanated authority without uttering a word. His reputation as a no-nonsense figure was clear in the way his sharp gaze scanned the room, missing nothing. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the room shuffled to its feet. Kendrick stood, his posture straight and composed. As the judge settled into his chair, a stark silence blanketed the room. Case after case was called with brisk efficiency, Judge Whitman's tone clipped and detached. Kendrick watched intently, noting the pace and demeanor of the proceedings. A middle-aged man arrived late, his suit rumpled, but the judge barely glanced at him. Moments later, a young woman in casual clothes slipped in unnoticed. Neither received so much as a reprimand. Kendrick took mental note but stayed focused on his own case. Finally, at 9:15 a.m., Kendrick's name rang out. He rose, his stride calm and deliberate, projecting professionalism despite the earlier delay. As he approached the podium, Judge Whitman's gaze hardened, a subtle but unmistakable shift in the room's energy. "You're late, Mr. Robinson," the judge said, his voice slicing through the room like a blade. "Do you think the court's time is less valuable than your own?" Kendrick raised his palm slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement. "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I was attending to urgent federal matters." The judge cut him off. "Excuses don't excuse tardiness. This court operates on order and respect. If you can't follow that, I suggest you reevaluate your priorities." Dozens of eyes turned toward Kendrick. He stood firm, his composure unshaken. "Your Honor, I understand the importance of timeliness. If I may, I'd like to present my case regarding the property tax adjustment." But Judge Whitman waved him off. "We'll get to that. First, there's the matter of contempt. Tardiness undermines the integrity of these proceedings. You are hereby fined $750. The pronouncement landed like a hammer blow, echoing through the room. Kendrick's jaw tightened, but his expression remained neutral. Around him, murmurs rippled. "Your Honor," Kendrick began, his tone steady, "may I explain?" "You may not," the judge snapped, raising his gavel. "Consider this a lesson in respecting the court." Kendrick returned to his seat, his mind racing. This wasn't just about being late, it was something deeper, something unspoken. He glanced at the others who had arrived late. None had been reprimanded. The disparity was glaring. Kendrick wasn't about to let it slide. Back in his seat, Kendrick opened his folder, but his focus shifted. His pen moved swiftly, jotting notes as his legal instincts kicked in. This was no ordinary morning. It was a test, and Kendrick wasn't one to fail. When his name was called again, Kendrick approached the podium with the same calm deliberation. "Your Honor," he began, placing a neatly organized folder on the podium, "I have documentation regarding the erroneous property tax adjustment. The property has been in my family for decades, and these adjustments do not align with the city's assessed values." He flipped to a specific page, pointing to the figures. "Here is the original tax assessment, which remained consistent for 5 years. However, the new adjustment reflects a 30% increase, without proper notification or explanation." Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, exuding an air of detached authority. "I'll review it in due time, Mr. Robinson. However, your tardiness this morning is a matter we cannot overlook. Do you truly believe that the urgency of your federal responsibilities justifies disrespecting this court?" Kendrick's composure remained steady, his expression calm. "Your Honor, I mean no disrespect. My delay was due to a federal case involving human trafficking, a matter I believe we can all agree requires immediate attention." The judge's eyes narrowed slightly, but his tone retained its sharp edge. "Your priorities, however noble, do not excuse breaking the rules. Court procedures exist for a reason." It wasn't the words themselves that struck Kendrick, it was the unspoken dismissal, the implicit message that his explanation wasn't good enough. His professional achievements, his character, his commitment to respecting the system, none of it seemed to matter in this courtroom. Kendrick inhaled slowly, letting the moment settle. "Your Honor," he began, his tone measured, "I understand the importance of rules. However, I must ask, are these rules applied equally to everyone in this courtroom?" A ripple of unease passed through the room, the tension palpable. The judge stiffened, the color rising in his face. "Are you questioning the integrity of this court, Mr. Robinson?" "I'm asking for clarity," Kendrick replied evenly. "It's important to ensure fairness is upheld, not just for myself, but for everyone here." The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "I will not tolerate accusations against this court. Your fine stands." Kendrick inclined his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Your Honor." He returned to his seat, the weight of the courtroom's gaze following him. The atmosphere was electric, a quiet admiration mingled with unease. Kendrick could feel it, the unspoken acknowledgement of a bias cloaked in authority. But this wasn't the first time he had encountered such prejudice, and he doubted it would be the last. Still, something about this moment felt different. The energy in the room had shifted, as though everyone was waiting for his next move. Kendrick discreetly pulled out his phone, typing notes with swift precision. He wasn't done, not by a long shot. This wasn't just about the $750 fine or even the property tax adjustment. It was about something far larger. As the courtroom session continued, Kendrick observed the room. An older black man seated 2 rows ahead turned slightly, offering Kendrick a brief, knowing glance. The court clerk, her fingers flying over the keyboard, occasionally hesitated, her discomfort evident. A young law student in the corner scribbled furiously in her notebook, her expression a mix of awe and determination. When the session ended, Kendrick lingered, watching the subtle ways people carried the weight of what had transpired. As he stepped outside into the crisp air, the tension still clung to him. The courthouse bustled with its usual rhythm, but Kendrick's thoughts were already forming a plan. He paused on the steps, staring at his phone. His thumb hovered over the contact for his assistant U.S. attorney. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "Not yet." Instead, he reviewed his notes, the interactions, the disparities he had observed. The picture was clear. This wasn't incidental, it was systemic. Kendrick's instincts told him he was standing at the edge of a much larger case, one that transcended property taxes or personal slights. Back in his car, Kendrick pulled his briefcase onto his lap, the gold-embossed emblem of the Department of Justice catching the sunlight. This wasn't just another morning. This was a call to action. By the time he re-entered the courtroom, most of the cases had concluded. The room was quieter now, with only a handful of stragglers flipping through papers or awaiting their turn. Judge Whitman sat at the bench, leafing through documents, his demeanor calm but visibly fatigued. Kendrick walked confidently toward the podium, badge and credentials in hand. The court clerk's fingers froze mid-type as she noticed him. Judge Whitman glanced up, his irritation flaring at the interruption. "Mr. Robinson, the court session has concluded. If you have further business, you'll need to schedule an appointment." "With respect, Your Honor," Kendrick said, his voice steady yet commanding, "I believe it's important to formally introduce myself." He raised his badge slightly, ensuring it was visible to all. "I'm Kendrick Robinson, Assistant United States Attorney for the Northern District of South Carolina. I've served the Department of Justice for over a decade, specializing in cases of human trafficking, corruption, and civil rights violations." The judge froze, his hands halting over the papers. The color drained from his face as Kendrick's words settled over the room. Spectators leaned in, their expressions a mix of curiosity and anticipation. "I was late this morning due to an urgent federal case," Kendrick continued, his tone firm but respectful. "And while I understand the importance of court procedures, I couldn't help but notice the disparity in how cases were handled today." The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. "Mr. Robinson, if you feel there was a procedural issue, you are welcome to file a formal complaint." "I've already begun documenting the events," Kendrick replied, holding up his notebook. "Not just my own treatment, but the unequal responses to other latecomers, particularly along racial lines. As an officer of the court, I have a duty to report any patterns of bias or discrimination." The judge leaned back, visibly uneasy. "Are you accusing this court of misconduct, Mr. Robinson?" "I'm stating what I observed," Kendrick said. "As a federal prosecutor, I've dedicated my career to ensuring justice is applied equally, regardless of who stands before the bench. What I witnessed today raises serious concerns." The silence in the room was deafening. The court clerk glanced nervously at the judge, her hands hovering uncertainly over the keyboard. The young law student in the corner was furiously jotting notes, her eyes wide with fascination. "This court takes such matters seriously," Judge Whitman said, his voice quieter now. "If you believe there was an error in judgment, I suggest addressing it through the appropriate channels." Kendrick placed his badge on the podium. "I intend to, Your Honor. But I also believe this is an opportunity to reflect on how we ensure fairness and equality in every courtroom." The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat, gripping the arms of his chair. For the first time, his authority seemed shaken. "You may go, Mr. Robinson," the judge said, his voice strained. Kendrick collected his credentials and turned to leave, but not before offering a final, deliberate glance at the room, a silent reminder that the pursuit of justice was far from over. "Thank you, Your Honor. I'll ensure this is addressed properly," Kendrick said, his voice steady but firm. As he walked out of the courtroom for the second time that morning, he felt the weight of every remaining spectator's gaze on his back. The significance of the moment wasn't lost on him. This wasn't just about standing up for himself. It was about challenging a system that too often failed to recognize its own flaws. Outside, Kendrick pulled out his phone and began typing a detailed email to his office. He included every observation, every interaction, and every instance of disparity he had witnessed. By the time he hit send, he knew this was only the beginning. The email moved faster than Kendrick anticipated. By the next morning, his phone buzzed with a call from the U.S. Attorney's office. Julia Harper, his supervisor and a no-nonsense attorney with decades of experience, spoke with urgency. Kendrick, I read your report, Julia began, her tone sharp but intrigued. If what you're describing is accurate, this isn't an isolated incident. It could indicate systemic bias. I believe it does, Kendrick replied, his conviction unwavering. What happened yesterday wasn't subtle. It's part of a pattern I've seen before. And I'm certain I'm not the only one who's experienced it. Juliet exhaled sharply. I'll reach out to the Judicial Review Commission. This needs to be handled delicately but thoroughly. In the meantime, gather as much documentation as you can. If this goes public, we need to be ready. The call ended, but Kendrick's work was just beginning. He spent hours piecing together every detail from the municipal court session, combing through public records, and noting glaring inconsistencies in fines and penalties issued by Judge Whitman. Patterns began to emerge, minor infractions resulting in disproportionately high fines for black defendants, while white defendants often received warnings or leniency. Kendrick reached out to colleagues and community members, including attorneys who had appeared in Judge Whitman's courtroom. The responses were overwhelming. Stories of disparate treatment flooded in, some whispered in confidence, others shared with bold defiance. A young black woman recounted being fined heavily for a parking violation, while a white man with multiple offenses received only a small fee. Another described how the judge frequently interrupted black defendants, rarely allowing them to fully explain their cases. Within days, the Judicial Review Commission initiated a formal inquiry. Investigators descended on the courthouse, requesting years of case records and interviewing staff. The court clerk, Mrs. Thompson, proved to be a pivotal figure. Nervously, she handed over a small notebook she had kept hidden in her desk drawer for years. These notes, she confessed, her voice trembling. Every time something didn't sit right, I wrote it down. I've been too afraid to say anything, but I can't ignore it anymore. The notebook painted a damning picture, dates, names, and instances of unequal treatment meticulously recorded. Investigators also spoke with James Wilson, the longtime bailiff in the courtroom. He shared his observations with quiet conviction. I've been here 15 years, Wilson said. I've seen how the judge treats people differently depending on who they are. I always knew it wasn't right, but I didn't think there was anything I could do. As the inquiry gained traction, the story began to leak into the local community. A young law student who had witnessed the courtroom exchange posted a detailed account on social media. Within hours, it gained traction, sparking outrage and a flood of similar testimonies. Headlines followed soon after: Bias in Greenville Courtroom, Federal Prosecutor Challenges Judge's Conduct. Kendrick found himself at the center of a growing storm. Calls from reporters came nonstop, but he chose to remain focused on the investigation. Meanwhile, the mounting pressure took its toll on Judge Whitman. Rumors swirled that he had been summoned to multiple closed-door meetings with judicial oversight committees. Though he publicly denied any wrongdoing, his confidence visibly wavered. By the end of the first week, Kendrick received another call from Julia. Her voice carried a mix of urgency and grim determination. The findings so far are staggering, she said. The numbers don't lie, Kendrick. Black defendants in his courtroom were fined 3 times more often than white defendants for the same infractions. It's systemic. What's the next step? Kendrick asked. We're taking this to the State Judicial Board, Julia replied. And Kendrick, this isn't going away. Be prepared for the media frenzy. Kendrick nodded, even as exhaustion weighed on him. This was bigger than he had imagined, but there was no turning back. By the end of the second week, the story had spread far beyond Greenville. National media outlets picked up the case, with headlines like Systemic Bias Unveiled, Federal Prosecutor Takes a Stand. Social media hashtags such as #EqualJusticeNow and #BiasInTheCourts trended for days, with thousands of people sharing their own experiences of courtroom discrimination. The investigation's findings were devastating. Over the past 5 years, Judge Whitman had fined black defendants an average of 300% more than white defendants for similar offenses. Late arrivals from white defendants were often overlooked, while black defendants faced reprimands or steep fines. Requests for leniency, such as payment plans, were disproportionately denied to minority defendants. The evidence wasn't just statistical, it was deeply human. Former defendants came forward, some publicly, others anonymously, to share their stories. A black mother recounted being fined $500 for contesting a minor zoning issue, despite presenting clear evidence that the city was at fault. A young man described how the judge had humiliated him in court, questioning his work ethic, only to dismiss a similar case from a white defendant minutes later. Local activist groups joined the fight, organizing rallies and demanding accountability. Outside the Greenville courthouse, protesters held signs reading "Justice should be blind" and "End bias now." Kendrick avoided the public spectacle as much as possible, choosing instead to focus on consolidating evidence with the Judicial Review Commission. Inside the courthouse, the pressure mounted. Longtime staff members began to speak out, their silence broken by the gravity of the investigation. Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, became a key figure. Her detailed notes, combined with years of court records, painted a comprehensive picture of bias spanning decades. "I never thought anyone would listen," she said during an interview with investigators. "But now that it's all coming out, I can't stay silent anymore." James Wilson, the veteran bailiff and longtime observer of Judge Whitman's courtroom, decided it was time to speak up publicly. In a statement to the Judicial Review Commission, he declared, "I've seen this kind of treatment for years. It's wrong, and it's long past time for something to be done." His words carried the weight of quiet endurance turned into resolute action. Judge Whitman, meanwhile, found himself increasingly isolated. Initially dismissing the accusations as mere misinterpretations, he was forced into damage control as the mounting evidence painted an undeniable picture. In a rare public statement, he expressed regret for any unintentional actions that may have caused harm. But the words rang hollow in the face of overwhelming proof to the contrary. Kendrick, inundated with attention, stayed grounded. He continued his responsibilities as a federal prosecutor, fully aware that his duties extended beyond this case. Yet, he couldn't ignore the messages pouring into his office. Emails, phone calls, and letters arrived from across the country, some offering support, others sharing harrowing stories of similar biases in courtrooms elsewhere. One particularly moving letter came from a retired attorney in Alabama. "For years, I saw the same injustices you're describing, but I never spoke up. Thank you for having the courage to do what so many of us couldn't." The movement began to grow beyond Greenville. Activists and reporters dug into court records across South Carolina, and other judges faced scrutiny. The state's Judicial Oversight Committee announced a sweeping review of municipal courts, vowing to root out systemic bias. By the end of the month, the Judicial Review Commission released its preliminary report. The findings were damning. Judge Whitman's actions were part of a larger, deeply embedded problem. The report called for immediate reforms, mandatory bias training for judges, regular audits of court decisions, and the establishment of independent oversight committees. Faced with the prospect of a public hearing and potential disciplinary action, Judge Whitman announced his resignation. In a brief statement, he said, "I believe it's in the best interest of this court and this community that I step aside." The announcement drew mixed reactions. Some saw it as an admission of guilt, while others viewed it as a necessary step toward healing. For Kendrick, it was a moment of vindication but not celebration. The resignation was just the beginning. The real work lay ahead. As reforms began to take shape, Kendrick found himself stepping into a new role. He was invited to speak at law schools, community forums, and legal conferences about his experience and the importance of challenging systemic bias. His story inspired young lawyers, particularly those from underrepresented backgrounds, to see themselves as agents of change. At one such event, a young black law student approached him after his speech. "You've shown me that the law isn't just about rules, it's about people. You've given me a reason to fight for justice." Kendrick smiled, humbled by the words. "The fight is just beginning. But if we all do our part, we can make the system better." 3 months after that fateful morning, the Greenville courthouse looked markedly different. The tired beige walls had been repainted, and a new welcome desk greeted visitors with a warmth that had long been absent. Signs in multiple languages directed people to resources they hadn't known were available: payment plans, legal aid, and procedural guides. Near the entrance, a small but meaningful plaque had been installed: "Equal justice is everyone's right." Inside, the changes were even more pronounced. Judge Whitman was gone, replaced by a younger judge known for fairness and impartiality. Systemic reforms were well underway. Court personnel attended mandatory bias training led by experts who tackled the subtle ways discrimination could seep into decision-making. Kendrick stood at the back of the renovated courtroom, scanning the room. He had been invited to speak to a group of local judges and lawyers about the changes. As he waited for his turn, he felt a mix of pride and cautious optimism. Change had begun, but he knew the road ahead was long. The ripple effects extended far beyond Greenville. Inspired by Kendrick's actions, communities across South Carolina and eventually the nation began reevaluating their court systems. State judicial boards implemented mandatory audits of case outcomes, focusing on racial and socioeconomic disparities. Oversight committees composed of legal experts, community advocates, and former defendants ensured accountability. In Kendrick's office, the momentum was palpable. The fine from that fateful morning now hung framed on his wall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of why he had taken a stand. Beneath it was a photo of young law students who had started a civil rights clinic in his honor. Their smiles radiated hope, a beacon for the next generation. James Wilson, the former bailiff, embraced his own role in the movement. He began leading bias training sessions for court officers. "Our job isn't just to keep order," he told a room of new hires. "It's to ensure that everyone who steps into this room is treated with dignity. If you see something wrong, you speak up. Silence is complicity." Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk whose records had been pivotal, was promoted to oversee a program focused on ethical court practices. She worked tirelessly, mentoring younger clerks and ensuring the mistakes of the past wouldn't be repeated. Kendrick's influence continued to grow. He began teaching a seminar at a nearby law school on ethics and civil rights in the judiciary. One afternoon, a student approached him with a notebook filled with ideas for reform. "What do you think is the most important thing we can do to make the system fairer?" she asked. Kendrick paused, then replied, "Listen. Listen to the people who come through our courts. Listen to those too afraid to speak up. Listening is where real change begins." Resistance to the reforms was inevitable. Some judges and attorneys claimed the new oversight measures undermined their authority. But the data told a different story. Within a year, Greenville's municipal court saw a significant decrease in racial disparities in fines and sentences. Defendants reported feeling treated with greater respect, and payment plans were approved more often. For Kendrick, the most rewarding moments came from the people who thanked him for making a difference. An elderly black man who had been in the courtroom that morning returned to express his gratitude. "I've been coming here for 40 years, the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've seen so much injustice. I never thought I'd see the day when someone finally said, 'Enough. Thank you for giving us hope.'" Months later, Kendrick stood at the podium of the courthouse where it had all begun. He was there for the unveiling of a new judicial ethics center, named in part after his efforts. Looking out at the crowd, judges, lawyers, clerks, and community members, he felt the enormity of the journey. "Justice isn't just about laws," he began. "It's about how we treat the people who come into our courtrooms. It's about fairness, dignity, and respect. And it's about ensuring that every person, no matter who they are, knows that they matter." The applause was thunderous. But as Kendrick scanned the room, his focus remained on the faces of those who had carried this fight with him. In them, he saw hope, determination, and the beginnings of true change. While the work was far from over, this was a step in the right direction.